Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today's story follows Tylen Vasquez, a board sensor officer on the forgotten border station Watcher's Crest, whose impossible readings reveal a colossal human warship, the UNS Prometheus, carrying power far beyond anything the Empire believes a primitive species could build. What starts as arrogance and a warning volley quickly turns into shock when the ship absorbs their attacks, slices a cruiser cleanly in half without killing anyone, and then calmly asks for dialogue, setting off a chain reaction that leads to cultural exchange, a galaxy-wide awakening, and the Galactic Compact, where humanity offers technology and protection in return for one promise: never again label young civilizations as beneath you. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today's story follows Tylen Vasquez, a board sensor officer on the forgotten border station Watcher's Crest, whose impossible readings reveal a colossal human warship, the UNS Prometheus, carrying power far beyond anything the Empire believes a primitive species could build. What starts as arrogance and a warning volley quickly turns into shock when the ship absorbs their attacks, slices a cruiser cleanly in half without killing anyone, and then calmly asks for dialogue, setting off a chain reaction that leads to cultural exchange, a galaxy-wide awakening, and the Galactic Compact, where humanity offers technology and protection in return for one promise: never again label young civilizations as beneath you. For 11 years, Tylen Vasquez's entire world was a screen of boring, predictable numbers. He was a sensor officer at Watcher's Crest, a rusty old Imperial border station floating at the edge of nowhere. His job? Watch the empty space separating the Empire from the great unknown and file reports about, well, nothing. But if you've ever felt stuck in a dead-end job, knowing you were meant for more, then you know exactly how Tylen felt just before his world turned upside down. Stick with me, because what he saw next would change the galaxy forever. Just as he was sipping his third cup of stimulant tea, a sound echoed from his console, a deep, resonant hum that meant one thing: something impossibly huge had just torn its way out of subspace. He set his cup down, his heart skipping a beat. On the screen, a number stared back at him, a number so big it had to be a prank. He blinked, leaned in closer, his brain refusing to process it. The object that had just appeared had the mass of a dreadnought-class warship. But that was impossible. Nobody had built a dreadnought in over 1,000 years. There was simply nothing left in the galaxy that needed that kind of firepower. Then came the second number, the one that made him place his cup down with surgical precision and sit bolt upright. The energy signature was 6 times more powerful than anything in the entire Imperial fleet. Not twice. 6. Tylen did what any good officer would do. He assumed his gear was broken. He started a full recalibration, a 4-minute process where he told himself this rust bucket station was just acting its age. "It's just a glitch," he muttered. "There's nothing out there that can pull those kinds of numbers." But when the calibration finished and he ran the scan again, the numbers were exactly the same. His hand shot to the comms panel, pressing the button for Commander Salon's quarters. He knew waking her in the middle of the night cycle was a bad idea. But there was a golden rule on the Crest. When the numbers don't make sense, you make it your superior's problem. 12 minutes later, Commander Drea Salon clicked onto the deck, a towering, 4-armed chelith. Her hard shell echoed her irritation with every step. "Vasquez, this had better be worth my sleep," she rasped, her voice like scraping stones. "I'm not sure what it is, Commander," Tylen admitted, pointing a trembling finger at his screen. "But I've double-checked everything." Salon loomed over his shoulder, her mandibles clicking softly, a sound that could mean she was either thinking or furious. With her species, it was a 50-50 shot. "Run a full spectral analysis," she commanded. "I wanted to know what that thing is made of." The results trickled in, and with each new piece of data, the puzzle got weirder. The ship's hull was a primitive steel-titanium alloy, something no advanced race had used in centuries. But layered on top of it was a carbon nano-weave of unbelievable density, and under that, something the database simply labeled unknown crystalline lattice. Steel? Salon said the word like it was poison. Who builds a warship out of steel? Tylan answered quietly. Someone who started with steel and just kept adding on. You could feel the tension in the room. Salon hated that answer because it hinted at a species that was learning and evolving way, way too fast. Any transmissions? She asked. Not yet. Wait. Another chime. Its transponder is syncing with our translation software now. They both stared at the screen as the alien language morphed into Galactic Common. The grammar was a little clunky, but the message was unmistakable. UNS Prometheus, Terran Unified Navy. We are requesting open dialogue. Salon read it 3 times, her disbelief palpable. She snapped at a junior officer behind them. Pull the species registry! Find Terran! The young officer's hands flew across his console. The file he pulled up was tiny. Terrans, he read, his voice shaky. Also known as humans. Homeworld, Earth. Tier 9, pre-spaceflight primitive. Last survey was 197 years ago. Tech level at the time, chemical rockets, fossil fuels, early nuclear fission. He continued. Notes. Species is highly divided into competing tribal nations. No unified government. Projected time to achieve spaceflight, 400 to 600 years. The deck fell silent. Tylan looked from the file that said primitive to the screen that showed a warship with 6 times the power of their mightiest vessel. That can't be a human warship, Salon stated, as if trying to will it into fact. Humans were supposed to be flinging glorified firecrackers at their own moon. The idea that they had built that wasn't just unlikely, it was ridiculous. Run the scan again, Salon ordered. Tylan ran it for the 3rd time. The numbers didn't budge. That thing was real, it was massive, and it was human. I'm contacting the 9th Fleet, Salon said, her shell clicking with grim resolve. Admiral Jur needs to see this. Now, Admiral Chaos Jur was the last person Tylan wanted involved. The Admiral was an old-school imperial supremacist, a fossil who believed his species was the pinnacle of creation and everyone else was either a tool or an obstacle. He'd probably never even heard of a species called humans. The communication was short and to the point. Salon sent all the data. The scans, the transponder signal, the analysis. 14 minutes later, a reply came back. It was an audio message, and Admiral Jur was laughing. Commander Salon, he chuckled, his voice dripping with condescension. What you found is likely some primitive freighter with an oversized engine strapped to it. The energy reading is cute, I'll admit, but a bonfire burns hot, Commander. It doesn't think. The Admiral continued. These humans have built themselves a big, loud toy. I'm sending Patrol Group 7 to handle it. 12 cruisers should be more than enough to shoo these upstarts back to their corner of the galaxy. If they resist, they are to be disciplined. This matter is closed. Jur out. The message ended, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. Sulin stood frozen, staring out the main viewport at the sea of stars. He didn't look at the spectral analysis, she whispered. No, Commander, Tylan agreed. He didn't. The unknown crystal, the layered defenses, the impossible power source. Jur had ignored it all. 12 cruisers, Sulin said, the word sounding like a death sentence. As she spoke, Tylan's console beeped again. The energy reading from the Prometheus was still climbing. At first, he assumed it had to be a sensor glitch, but it wasn't. The ship was powering up. Any systems that had been running on low power were now coming fully online. As the numbers climbed, a cold dread settled in Tylan's stomach. He realized the readings they'd been getting were of the ship at rest, sleeping. Now it was waking up. Somewhere out in the star-dusted darkness, 12 Valori cruisers were jumping to the neutral zone. Their crews were probably laughing about this job, a simple escort mission for some lost primitives. Easy money. They'd probably be home in time for dinner. Tylan reached for his tea. It was stone cold. He drank it anyway, having a gut feeling it was going to be a very, very long night. On his screen, the energy readings just kept rising. The Prometheus was waiting. Quinton and Patrol Group 7 had absolutely no clue what they were flying into. Deep within the Watcher's crest, Commander Celine was walking back to her quarters. Sleep was out of the question. She just sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall, thinking about a species that went from burning dead trees for energy to building a ship that made the entire Imperial fleet look like a bunch of bathtub toys. She thought about how they'd done it all in less than 200 years. She thought about what kind of people could achieve something like that. And then, she thought about the kind of bone-deep fear that must have driven them to do it. She didn't get a wink of sleep that night, so in the morning, when the first reports trickled in from the neutral corridor, she wasn't surprised. Not in the slightest. Because she had seen the readings with her own eyes, and those readings were crystal clear. Whatever was coming, the Empire was not ready for it. Not even a little bit. Aboard the Fang of Dominion, Patrol Commander Essex Vin stood on the bridge, feeling pretty good about himself. He was young for his rank. His scales still shone a brilliant green, and his eyes were sharp, hungry. He'd clawed his way to this position with a perfect mix of raw ambition and the right political friends. He wore his uniform as if it had been molded just for him. In his own mind, he was already an admiral. He just needed that one perfect moment to prove it to everyone else. This mission wasn't that moment, he figured, but it was a cakewalk. And an easy mission still looked great on a service record. The 12 Catherick-class cruisers of Patrol Group 7 dropped out of subspace in perfect unison. Vin had drilled his crews on this for months, and the formation was absolutely flawless. 12 ships, each 1.2 kilometers long, arrayed in a textbook encirclement pattern. Their hulls were a sleek, dark purple, with their plasma lances glowing a faint, menacing blue along the weapon rails. They were truly beautiful ships. Vin never got tired of looking at them, knowing each one packed enough firepower to scorch a small moon down to a barren rock. "All ships report ready, Commander," his communications officer announced. "Good," Vin replied, clasping his hands behind his back and gazing at the main viewport. "So, where's our guest?" The sensor officer gestured to the screen. A single contact sat dead ahead, motionless in the void of the neutral corridor. It was just a tiny dot on the display. A blip, nothing to write home about. "Open a channel," Vin ordered. "Standard Imperial warning." He cleared his throat, letting his voice drop into its most commanding tone. "Unidentified vessel. This is Patrol Commander Essex Vin of the Valori Imperial Navy. You have trespassed into restricted space. You are hereby ordered to power down all weapons, transmit your navigation logs, and prepare for escort out of this sector. Failure to comply will be met with overwhelming force. You have 60 seconds to respond." He was quite pleased with how that sounded. He'd practiced it in the mirror. The seconds ticked by. Vin waited. His bridge crew waited. After 40 seconds, the comms officer spoke up. "Commander, the vessel is responding. We have audio and visual." "Put it on screen." The main display flickered, then resolved into an image of something Vin had never seen before. A human face. It was a woman who looked to be in her middle years, though with aliens it was always hard to be sure. She had dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, brown skin, and a thin scar that traced a line from her left eyebrow down to her cheek. Her eyes were calm. Not scared, not angry. Just calm. Like the surface of a deep, dark lake. "This is Captain Lena Vasquez of the United Nations ship Prometheus, Terran Unified Navy," the woman said. Her Galactic common was surprisingly good, much better than the transponder suggested, though it had a strange, clipped accent. "We are on a peaceful diplomatic mission to the Valori High Conclave. We have no hostile intent. We request safe passage and an audience with your leadership." Vin just stared. She was not what he'd expected. He wasn't even sure what he had expected. The files described humans as soft-skinned mammals with no natural armor, claws, or venom. No biological advantages to speak of. This woman had none of those things. But there was something in her eyes that set Vin on edge. It was the look of someone who had stared violence in the face and made peace with it a long, long time ago. "Your request is denied," Vin snapped. "You will power down and submit to our escort. That is not up for negotiation." "I understand your position, Commander," Vasquez replied, her voice even. "But I must respectfully decline. We've traveled a very long way, and we won't be turning back now. I would much prefer we settle this with a conversation." Vin felt a surge of annoyance. He wasn't accustomed to being told no. He opened his mouth to deliver a sharp reply, but his sensor officer cut him off. "Commander," the officer said, his voice suddenly quiet, tight with tension. "I have a visual on the target." "Put it on the secondary display." The second screen flared to life with a magnified image of the human ship, and in that instant, every single sound on the bridge died. The Prometheus was gigantic. It was 4.7 kilometers long. Vin's mind struggled to process the number. It just didn't compute. His own flagship, the Fang of Dominion, was only 1.2 kilometers. This ship was nearly 4 times as long. It just hung there in space like a mountain that had been carved into the shape of a weapon. Its hull was all sharp angles and flat planes, giving it the look of something built for one job and one job only. There were no gentle curves, no elegant designs. It was brutal. It was honest. And it was covered, absolutely covered, in weapons. Thousands of them. Turret mounts lined every flat surface in neat, terrifying rows. Missile bays, point defense clusters, and running along the ship's spine was a series of massive weapons whose purpose Vin couldn't guess, but their sheer size made his stomach turn to ice. "That's not possible," Vin whispered. "Commander," the sensor officer said, his voice now trembling slightly. "I'm reading layered shielding around that vessel. Multiple, overlapping energy fields. Sir, our records say layered shielding is purely theoretical. No known species has ever made it work." "What about their reactor?" "Stellar fusion, Commander. The reactor output is—" He paused, rechecking his readings. He checked them a third time. "The output is roughly 6 times greater than our most powerful capital ship." The bridge was dead silent. 1,200 crew members across 12 ships, and you could hear a pin drop. Vin looked at the image of the Prometheus, then at his own 12 cruisers arranged in their perfect, pretty formation. He felt like a man who'd brought a pocket knife to a fight, only to find out his opponent had brought a volcano. But he had his orders. Admiral Jur had authorized force, and Essex Vin hadn't climbed the ranks by backing down. "All ships," he said, his voice strained. "Fire a warning volley. Plasma lances, 15% power. Target the space directly in front of their ship." 12 cruisers fired as one. Beams of brilliant blue-white plasma sliced across the black, converging on a single point just ahead of the Prometheus. It was a standard show of force, meant to display power and resolve. The beams struck the Prometheus's shields and vanished. They weren't deflected or scattered. They simply ceased to exist, absorbed into the shield matrix as if they were nothing. Vin's sensor officer made a noise that was half gasp, half sob. "The shields, they absorbed our fire, Commander," he stammered. "All of it. Shield strength hasn't dropped. It's increased by 0.3%. That ship is using our own weapons fire to charge its batteries." Vin felt the blood drain from his face. He had shot at the human ship and had literally made it stronger. The communications console chirped. Captain Vasquez was back on the screen. She looked exactly the same as before. Calm, patient, unbothered. "We'll count that one as a friendly hello," she said. "The next one we won't." Vin's first officer, a scarred old veteran named Toth, leaned in close. "Commander," he whispered urgently, "I strongly advise we contact Admiral Jur and request new orders. This is not the situation we were briefed on." Vin should have listened. Any sane officer would have listened. But Vin wasn't sane in that moment. He was humiliated. He was furious that his warning shot had been shrugged off like a gnat. He was enraged that this alien woman was looking at him from her screen with an expression that bordered on pity. And he was mortified that his entire bridge crew was watching him fail. "All ships!" Vin roared, his voice tight and cracking with fury. "Full broadside! All weapons! Fire at will!" 12 Catharique-class cruisers unleashed absolute hell. Plasma lances at maximum power, kinetic accelerators, entire salvos of missiles. The combined might of Patrol Group 7 was enough to crack the crust of a small planet. The space between the fleets turned into a blazing white sun, and for a terrifying moment, nothing else was visible. Then, the light cleared. The Prometheus was still there, completely untouched. Its shields just faintly shimmered, like the surface of a lake after someone skips a tiny stone across it. That's it. And then the ship did something it wasn't supposed to be able to do. It was 4.7 kilometers long and weighed as much as a small asteroid. Ships that big are supposed to move like sleeping giants, slow and ponderous. That's just how physics works. But the Prometheus didn't seem to care. It launched forward so fast that half the sensor screens in the patrol group just went haywire trying to follow it. 1 second it was in front of them, the next it had slipped between their cruisers, weaving through their perfect circle like a fish swimming through reeds. The defense guns on its hull casually swatted away missiles like a person brushing crumbs off a kitchen table. The few plasma shots that got through just bent around the ship's shields and fizzled into empty space. The whole fight, if you could even call it that, was over in 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, the Prometheus had moved to the very center of their formation, completely surrounded by all 12 cruisers, and it hadn't fired a single shot. It had just shown them, clear as day, that it could go anywhere it wanted, and they were powerless to stop it. On the bridge of the Fang of Dominion, Commander Vin gripped the railing so tight his claws dug into the metal. "Commander," the sensor officer said, his voice suddenly completely flat. The way people sound when their brain has decided panic is a waste of energy. "Their shields are at 97%. Our entire attack took down their shields by 3%. 3%. 12 warships firing everything they had for 3%. Meanwhile, on the Prometheus, Commander Deshi Okafor watched the data stream with the same mild interest someone might have reading a weather forecast. He was a tall man with dark skin and a neat buzz cut of gray hair. He'd designed this whole combat strategy himself, running thousands of simulations against every alien weapon they knew of. This was playing out almost exactly like his models said it would. The Imperial weapons were powerful, but clumsy, built to overwhelm with sheer numbers, not with skill. Against the Prometheus's smart shield system, they were basically useless. "They can't touch us, Captain," Okafor said to Vasquez. Captain Vasquez was still in her command chair. She hadn't moved an inch during the entire confrontation. She hadn't even raised her voice. She had just watched 12 alien warships unload their arsenals on her ship, and all she felt was a deep sense of sadness. She didn't come here for a fight. She came here to talk. But for talking to work, the other side needs to know exactly who they're talking to. "1 turret," Vasquez said quietly. "Forward battery 7. Lowest possible power setting." "Lowest power confirmed," Okafor replied, typing in the command. A single small turret on the front of the Prometheus turned and locked onto the Fang of Dominion. It wasn't even a main cannon. It was the kind of gun they used to shoot down tiny fighters or incoming missiles. Okafor set it to its absolute minimum output, roughly 0.1% of what the weapon was truly capable of. It fired. A beam of white-blue light, perfectly straight and impossibly thin, shot across the space between them. It hit the Fang of Dominion right in the middle. The beam didn't cause an explosion. It didn't blast a hole. It just cut, It sliced through the cruiser's hull the way a hot wire goes through a block of ice, severing the ship cleanly into two perfect halves. Imagine commanding the most powerful warship in the sector, the Dominion's Fang, a vessel that has never known defeat. Then, in the blink of an eye, you're floating in the front half of it. The cut was so clean, so impossibly perfect, that every emergency system kicked in flawlessly. The air was breathable, the lights flickered to a calm red emergency glow, and the artificial gravity didn't even stutter. No one died. No one was even scratched. Vin found himself looking through the main viewport at the rear end of hin own ship, drifting away into space. The edge of the cut glowed like a fresh wound, the most beautiful and terrifying thing he had ever laid eyes on. Then a voice filled the bridge, calm and steady as a deep river. It was Captain Vasquez. "Humanity doesn't want a war," she said, her tone unwavering. "But we're finished being observed, poked, and dismissed like some backwater experiment. We've been looking up at you for a long time. Well, now we're here. Take us to your council." Absolute silence fell across all 12 ships of the Imperial fleet. What could they say? They had unleashed their entire arsenal and hadn't left a single mark. In return, the humans fired one shot from a tiny defensive turret on minimum power and had split a cruiser in half without hurting a soul. The message couldn't be clearer. It was the loudest silence the galaxy had ever heard. Vin floated on his ruined bridge and stared out the window. The Prometheus just hung there in space, huge and dark and patient. Its weapons were powered down. Its shield still had that faint shimmer. It was waiting. It had all the time in the world. With a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else, he reached for his comms panel. His claws were shaking. His whole body was shaking. He opened a channel to Admiral Jur's flagship and spoke the 3 words that would rewrite galactic history. "Send everyone now." Then he cut the channel and just sat there, in the red glow of his broken ship, trying to process what had just happened. 200 years. That's all the time it took the humans. 200 years to go from burning fossil fuels to this. To a ship that treated the Empire's best weapons like they were raindrops on a windshield. What kind of species could do that? And more importantly, what kind of species would choose not to use that power to destroy? The Prometheus could have vaporized all 12 cruisers in a heartbeat. Vin knew that for a fact now. But it didn't. It just cut his ship in half with the precision of a teacher drawing a line on a chalkboard. It made its point, and then it stopped. That scared Vin more than anything. A species that builds weapons like that and then chooses restraint is infinitely more dangerous than one that just blindly attacks. Attackers are easy to figure out. You know what they want. But a species that could utterly annihilate you and decides not to? You could never know their limits. You could never know when they might change their mind. The Prometheus waited in the darkness. Far away, Admiral Jur was getting the message. He would hear the raw fear in Vin's voice, and for the first time in his long, decorated career, the old admiral would realize that the universe wasn't what he thought it was. It was so much bigger, and now the humans were a part of it. The High Conclave of the Veori Galactic Empire was meeting in a chamber that was older than most starfaring races. It was carved into the very heart of their capital world, Veor Prime, sculpted from a single, living crystal that grew and changed over the millennia. The walls pulsed with a soft, amber light. The ceiling was so high that clouds would sometimes form up there. 1,000 seats were arranged in a massive circle, and in those seats sat the leaders of 100 different species who had built an empire that spanned 3 arms of the galaxy. And they were terrified. Of course, no one said it out loud. These were the most powerful people in the known universe. They didn't admit to things like fear, but you could feel it in the room, like a chill that wouldn't go away. It had been 3 days since Patrol Group 7 was completely humbled in the neutral zone. In those 3 days, the news had shot across every network in the Empire. A human warship, just one. It had ignored the firepower of 12 cruisers like it was nothing, then sliced one of them in two with a weapon on its lowest setting. They had checked the sensor log 17 times. Nobody believed it the first time, or the second, or the fifth. By the 17th time, the disbelief had curdled into something much colder. Admiral Jur had scrambled the entire 9th expansion fleet. 800 warships were now blockading the neutral zone, weapons hot, crews on edge. But the Prometheus hadn't budged. It just sat in space like a boulder in a stream, letting the chaos flow around it, completely unbothered. And then, the humans sent a shuttle. Conclave Speaker Orthman stood in the middle of the great chamber and watched the human ambassador enter. Orth was a Dravathi, which meant he basically looked like an ancient tree that had learned how to walk. His bark-like skin was deeply wrinkled with age, and his branch-like arms moved slowly, deliberately. He had led the conclave for 400 years, and in all that time, he had never felt the chamber be this silent. The human ambassador was a woman named Elena Zhao. By the standards of most of the beings in the room, she was small. She had black hair with streaks of gray and wore a simple dark uniform with no medals or awards on it. She walked with the ramrod straight posture of someone who had been a soldier long before she became a diplomat. 2 human guards followed her, both of them tall and quiet, their eyes scanning everything. Zhao reached the center of the chamber and stopped. She looked up at the 1,000 faces staring down at her. Reptilian faces, insectoid faces, crystalline faces, faces of species that were sailing between the stars when humans were still living in caves. She didn't look scared. She didn't look hostile. She looked like a person who had been patiently waiting for this exact moment for a very, very long time. "My name is Elena Xiao," she announced, her voice echoing clearly across the enormous hall. "I'm here representing the Terran Unified Government and the 7 billion people of Earth. I've come with a message, and I've come with a gift." She raised a small object. It was a crystal about the size of her fist, glowing with a soft blue light. "This," Zhao explained, "is a data crystal. It holds the complete technical schematics for the ship your Navy ran into 3 days ago, the UNS Prometheus. It also contains a full breakdown of the Terran Unified Navy's current military strength. We're giving you this information, no strings attached." A wave of murmurs rippled through the hall. Speaker Orth lifted one of his branch-like arms, and the room fell silent. "Before your experts dig into this data," Zhao went on, "I'd like to tell you a story. I believe it will give you some much-needed context for what you're about to discover." She paused, took a deep breath, and began. 197 years ago, the Valori survey vessel Quiet Observer finished its mapping mission of the Sol system. It spent 14 days scanning Earth, logging our population, tech level, and cultural progress. It labeled humans as a Tier 9 species, pre-spaceflight primitives, and then simply moved on. It was just another routine survey. The Valori had cataloged thousands of primitive races. Humans were nothing special. But the Quiet Observer made a critical error. As it was leaving Earth's orbit, one of its small scanning probes malfunctioned and tumbled down into our atmosphere. It crashed into the Pacific Ocean, 4 kilometers beneath the waves, in a trench so deep no human had ever reached it. It lay there for 6 years, until a deep-sea research sub stumbled upon it completely by accident. The governments of Earth had no idea what they'd found, at least not at first. The probe was busted up, and its technology was so far beyond ours it might as well have been pure magic. But humanity possessed a trait that the Valori survey completely missed. Their report noted moderate intelligence. What it should have said was relentless, obsessive, and terrified intelligence. Because that probe taught humanity something that changed our world forever. We were not alone. And the other beings in this galaxy were so advanced that the gap between us was almost incomprehensible. It was like an ant discovering the existence of giants. The ant can't fight the giants. It can't hide from them. All it can do is pray the giants never decide to step on it. Humans refused to accept that fate. An international scientific organization was formed in absolute secrecy. It was called the Black Vault Program, and it became the single largest and most ambitious undertaking in all of human history. Every major nation on the planet poured its best scientists, engineers, you name it, and resources into it. For the very first time, our entire species united for one purpose: survival. The man chosen to lead the Black Vault program was named Arab Misra. He was a physicist from a country called India, and he was the kind of man who looked at an impossible problem and simply refused to believe it couldn't be solved. He brought together the most brilliant minds on Earth and gave them a single directive: take this alien tech apart, figure it out, and then build something better. They didn't just reverse engineer the probe. For most species, that would have been more than enough. They would have figured out how the alien tech worked and just made copies. That would have been the sensible thing to do. But humans weren't being sensible. Humans were terrified. And that fear did something to the human mind that even Misra didn't see coming. It didn't make us cautious. It made us incredibly creative. Every piece of alien technology they salvaged from that probe wasn't seen as an answer, but as a challenge. They looked at the Valori plasma reactor and said, "This is clever, but it's not good enough." They studied the subspace drive schematics and said, "This is functional, but it's too slow." They analyzed the hull's alloy and said, "This is tough, but it's not unbreakable." And then they improved on every single bit of it. In 40 years, they had matched the probe's level of technology. In 80 years, they had blown past it. And in 120 years, they were developing technologies the probe's creators had never even dreamed of. The contained stellar fusion reactor? That was a human invention. No other race had done it. We took their concept of plasma containment and pushed it to its absolute limit, until we could hold a tiny piece of a star inside a magnetic bottle the size of a living room. The crystalline hull lattice? A human invention. We grew it in orbital labs, molecule by molecule, creating a material tougher than anything found in nature. A material that could heal itself when damaged. The layered shield matrix? Another human invention. Every other species in the galaxy used single-layer energy shields. The Valori had a theory that overlapping shields might work, but the math just never added up for them. Human mathematicians made it work. They solved it in a university, on a simple blackboard. And the woman who cracked the final equation was just 26 years old. And we did all of this in total silence. No radio signals, no galactic expansion, no colonies, nothing. For 200 years, humanity hid from the galaxy. We built our entire fleet in the freezing blackness of the Oort cloud, that massive shell of ice and rock at the edge of our solar system, so far from our sun that no one would ever bother looking there. We trained our crews. We tested our weapons. We prepared. And we waited. Xiao finished her story. The chamber was utterly still. Not a single being moved. Not a soul spoke. 1,000 delegates from 100 different worlds sat frozen in their ancient seats, trying to wrap their minds around what they had just heard. Speaker Orth was the first to find his voice. It was low and raspy, like the wind rattling through old trees. "You're telling us," he said slowly, "that your species went from chemical rockets to star-faring warships in less than 200 years? "Yes," Xiao said simply. "That's not possible. And yet, here I am." Orth was silent for a moment. Then he gestured to the conclave's head analyst, a Valori scientist named Korith, who was hunched over the data crystal with a portable console. Korith looked up. His face had gone pale, like old parchment. "The data is confirmed," Korith stammered, his voice cracking. "The Prometheus is one ship in a fleet of 300 dreadnoughts of similar power. The Terran Unified Navy also commands roughly 4,000 smaller ships, including destroyers, frigates, and fast attack vessels. Based on the specifications they've provided, any single Terran dreadnought could engage and destroy our entire Ninth Fleet." He paused, glancing down at his console and then back up. "Any single one," he repeated, his voice filled with awe. "And they have 300 of them." The chamber exploded into chaos. 1,000 voices from a dozen languages all clamored at once, but they were all saying the same thing. "This can't be real. It has to be a bluff. It must be a trick." But it wasn't a trick. The data was wide open. The specs were incredibly detailed. The humans had given them everything, right down to the reactor designs and weapons frequencies. They weren't hiding a thing. And that, more than anything, is what terrified Speaker Orth. A species that conceals its power is a species that fears being discovered. But a species that displays its power so openly is a species that fears nothing at all. He raised his arms again, and the chamber eventually quieted down. It took longer this time. "Ambassador Xiao," Orth said, "I have to ask the question that I'm sure is on everyone's mind in this room. You have built the most formidable military this galaxy has ever known. You did it in secret, in silence, in the dark. And now you come to us and reveal all of it. And you claim you want peace." He leaned forward, his ancient eyes deep and searching. "If you hold this much power," he said, "why come to us peacefully? Why not just take what you want? You could burn our worlds. You could crush our fleets. You could bring our empire to its knees in a single campaign. Why are you here, in this chamber, asking to talk?" Elena Xiao was quiet for a long moment. She looked down at her hands, then back up at the old speaker, and when she spoke again, her voice was different. It was softer, not weaker, just honest in a way it hadn't been before. "Because we know what it's like to be alone and afraid," she said. "We built all of this because we were absolutely terrified of you. Every ship, every weapon, every piece of technology we ever created was born from one thing: fear. We looked out at the stars and saw a 12,000-year-old empire that had cataloged us like insects in a jar. We had no idea if you'd come back. We didn't know if you'd one day decide that our planet was useful, but our species was not. So we built. We kept building until we were absolutely certain that nothing in this galaxy could ever threaten us again." She paused. "But we didn't build all of this to destroy you. We built it so we could finally stand before you as equals and say what I'm about to say now." She glanced around the chamber one last time. "No species in this galaxy should ever have to look up at the stars and feel the way that we felt. Alone, terrified, and wondering if anyone out there would even care if they lived or died. We built a wall around our world because we felt we had no other choice. Now we're here to make sure that no one else, including you, ever has to build a wall like that again." The chamber was silent once more, but this was a completely different kind of silence. The first silence was from shock. This silence was something else entirely. It was the sound of 1,000 minds reconsidering everything they thought they knew. And in the back of the chamber, in a private booth reserved for military observers, Admiral Kaios Juror sat completely alone. He had been listening to the whole thing on a secure channel. On his console, the technical data from the human's information crystal glowed. Jur, the Grand Admiral, had personally gone through every single line, every number. He was old, a veteran of 1,000 campaigns who had commanded fleets for longer than entire species had existed. Fear was a tool he used on others, a weakness for the young and unprepared. He had never felt it himself, but as his hands rested on the console, he couldn't stop them from shaking. He was terrified now, not of the human ships, their weapons, or their physics-defying reactors. He was afraid because he, unlike anyone else in that chamber, truly understood what the human ambassador had meant. She had told them that humanity built all of this out of fear, and Jur knew, better than anyone, what fear could do. He had built his career on it, pushing cornered species into desperate acts. But he had never encountered a species that was terrified of the entire galaxy. A species that had looked out at the vast, cold, uncaring universe and decided, we will not be prey. He'd never seen a people take their collective terror and forge it into a weapon that could make an ancient empire tremble. He glanced at the readouts again. 300 dreadnoughts, 4,000 support ships, and technology so advanced his top engineers couldn't even begin to comprehend it. And humanity had built it all in just 200 years. His own empire had taken 12,000 years to get where it was, and it hadn't innovated in centuries, simply because it never had to. His hand still trembled. Silently, he opened a private channel to the 9th Fleet. His voice, a product of lifelong discipline, came out perfectly steady. "All ships," he commanded, "stand down. Power down your weapons and return to standard patrol formation. This is not a drill." He gave no explanation. He just closed the channel and sat back in the dim light of his booth, listening as Ambassador Xiao began to lay out the terms for humanity's new place in the galaxy. And far out in the quiet dark, the human flagship Prometheus waited. It was a fortress built by scared children who had grown up and decided that power without compassion was just brutality. For the first time in 12,000 years, the galaxy seemed to be holding its breath. In the weeks that followed, the Valori Galactic Empire did what all massive bureaucracies do when faced with the unknown. It started arguing with itself. Factions formed overnight. Some screamed for an alliance, others for total isolation. Some wanted to just ignore the humans and hope they'd go away, and a very loud minority wanted war. No one wanted war more than Counselor Veth Skull. He was a pure-blooded Valori warrior, a general long before he became a politician. He proudly wore his old military medals over his formal robes, a constant reminder that he'd earned his power with blood, not talk. He was tall, with scales that had aged from a vibrant green to a deep, burnished bronze, and he had the booming voice of a man who expected to be obeyed. On the 7th day, he stood before the council and made his case. "You are all being played for fools," he roared, never one to soften his words. "The humans show up with a smile and an open hand, and you line up like hatchlings taking candy from a stranger. Think! Why would any species show its full military strength to a potential rival? There's only one answer. Because they're hiding something even bigger. What they showed us is a distraction. What they're not showing us is what should keep you awake at night." A murmur went through the chamber. Skull leaned in. 200 years ago, they were burning dead trees to stay warm. Now they have a fleet that could wipe us out. What will they have in another 200 years? Or 500? Every single day we wait, they get stronger. If we want to survive, we have to strike them now, while we still can. It was a powerful speech. And in a cold, brutal way, he wasn't entirely wrong. Several council members nodded, the fear he was selling finding fertile ground in their own anxieties. Speaker Orth, presiding over the session, listened patiently. When Skull was finished, Orth simply noted his position and moved on to the next topic. Cultural exchange. Because while the politicians and generals were busy rattling their sabers, something else was happening, something unexpected, something far more powerful than any weapon humanity had ever designed. The humans had started sharing their culture. It was standard procedure, a boring part of every first contact protocol where species exchanged language files, history, and scientific basics. The Valori had done this 1,000 times and had never seen anything that wasn't, at its core, the same old thing. Art is art, music is music, stories are stories. Or so they thought. Human culture was different. The first hint of a problem came from the Cultural Analysis Division. when a junior analyst named Preth was told to catalog the human music files. He was a young Valori, and he figured the boring task would take him maybe an afternoon. 3 weeks later, he was a sleep-deprived wreck. The issue was the sheer volume. The humans hadn't sent a sample of their music. They had sent all of it. Thousands of years of it, from primitive drum beats to orchestral arrangements so complex they broke his analytical software. Preth put on a piece called Symphony No. 9 by a human named Beethoven. When it was over, he just sat at his desk for 20 minutes, completely unable to move or speak. He didn't know why, but the music had reached into his soul and flipped a switch he never knew existed. And he wasn't the only one. The music ripped through the capital city like a wildfire. Copies were passed around secretly between analysts, then students, then the general public. Within 2 weeks, you could hear Beethoven playing in public parks on the Valori homeworld. Within 3 weeks, names like Bach, Mozart, and a strange group called Pink Floyd were being seriously debated by top academics. Within a month, a famous philosopher published a paper declaring that human music was the most advanced form of emotional communication ever encountered in the galaxy. But the music was just the opening act. The literary division got the human fiction archive and had no idea what to do with it. Of course, other species had stories, creation myths, heroic legends, simple fables, but humans had turned fiction into something else entirely. They had invented whole universes that never existed, filled with people who had never lived, facing problems that had never happened. And they wrote with such raw, emotional honesty that aliens from across the galaxy found themselves deeply invested in the lives of characters who weren't even real. A Dravathi librarian, a member of a species that biologically cannot cry, read a human book called Les Misérables and wept for 3 straight days. Her body literally found a way to create tears. An alien general was trying to figure out humanity, and it was giving him a headache. See, he'd just read 2 human books. One was called The Art of War, a brilliant manual for crushing your enemies. The other was All Quiet on the Western Front, a heartbreaking plea to just stop the fighting. And the same species wrote both. He just sat there, stumped. How could a species be masters of war and at the same time argue so passionately for peace? And then there was their humor. It wasn't like anything else in the galaxy. It was darker, sharper somehow. Humans could be cruel and kind in the very same joke. They'd make jokes about death, about pain, about how pointless everything seemed. And somehow, it made the darkness feel smaller, not bigger. It was so weird that the Chalith, a species with no concept of comedy, got obsessed with human stand-up. They even started their own open mic nights. They were awful, truly terrible, but they never gave up, which, ironically, was a very human thing to do. And right in the middle of all this cosmic confusion, a human showed up on the alien homeworld. Her name was Dr. Raina Solwyn, a scientist who'd studied aliens her whole life, but had never, ever met one. She had no idea she was about to walk into the center of a galactic storm. She was 41 years old, with a wild mane of red hair that refused to be tamed, and she greeted everything with a smile. She smiled at the buildings. She smiled at the street food. She even smiled at the aliens who stood twice her height and could snap her in 2 with one hand. She was a constant stream of questions, not the probing kind from an investigator, but the wide-eyed questions of a child discovering the world for the first time. The conclave gave her a guide, a young student named Theric, chosen because he was junior enough to be disposable. They figured the assignment was trivial. They couldn't have been more wrong. The first time Theric met Dr. Thorne, she was already causing a scene. She was standing right in the middle of the street, her mouth hanging open as she stared up at the Capitol's crystal spires. "This is the most incredible thing I have ever seen," she said, before he could even introduce himself. Theric was stumped. The crystal spires were ancient. Everyone on the planet had seen them 1,000,000 times. Nobody considered them beautiful anymore. They were just there, part of the landscape. "They're just government offices," he said flatly. "I know," Dr. Thorne replied, her gaze still fixed on the sky. "But just look at how the light plays through them. It's like they're breathing." Therick glanced up at the towers he'd walked past every single day for 6 years. He had never once noticed the light. But looking now, he saw it. She was right. It was stunning. This kept happening over the next few days. Dr. Thorne found wonder in things Therick had long since tuned out. She was captivated by the intricate patterns on a cheelith's shell, spending a whole hour sketching them in a little notebook she took everywhere. She tried some Valori street food and made such noises of pure joy that the vendor, delighted, gave her a second helping for free. She noticed that the Dravathi elders hummed a low tune when they were deep in thought, and she stood near one for 20 minutes, just listening, a look of absolute serenity on her face. Therick was utterly baffled by her. She belonged to a species that had engineered weapons capable of shattering planets, yet she was giddy over street food. She represented a fleet of warships that could bring the Empire to its knees, and she was doodling shell patterns in a notebook. None of it added up. On the 5th day, Dr. Thorne handed him a small, smooth rectangle that fit perfectly in his palm. It had a single button and a tiny speaker. "It's a music player," she explained. "I put some things on it I thought you might enjoy." That night, back in his room, Therick pressed the button. The first notes of Beethoven's 9th Symphony, the Ode to Joy, began to play. He sat on the edge of his bed, listening. At first, the sounds were just alien. His people's music was all sharp, rhythmic clicks, like shells tapping together. This was something else entirely. It was complex, layered. It started small, and then it swelled, adding new instruments, new voices, all weaving together into a sound so immense it felt impossible it could come from such a tiny device. And then, human voices began to sing. He didn't understand the language, but it didn't matter. The emotion in their voices transcended words. It was pure joy, not the simple, easy joy of a nice day or a good meal. This was a joy that had been won through suffering, the joy of a people who had stared into the abyss and defiantly chose to sing back at it. Therick didn't even know he was crying until the tears dripped from his mandibles. His species rarely cried. It wasn't a typical biological reaction, but his body was reacting anyway, just like the librarian who had wept while reading a human novel. The music had somehow bypassed every cultural and biological wall and spoken to something ancient and universal inside him. He played it again and again. He listened to it 7 times that night, forgoing sleep entirely. The next morning he found Dr. Thorne in her usual spot, admiring the crystal towers. "Why?" was the only word he could force out. She turned to him, her eyes knowing. She understood exactly what he was asking. "Because we feel everything," she said, her voice soft. "Every emotion, all the time, all at once. Joy, grief, rage, love, fear. We can't switch any of it off, so we had to learn to channel it into things, into music, stories, paintings, dance. It's how we survive ourselves." Therick let that sink in. He pictured a species that felt things so deeply they had to invent art just to stop their own emotions from tearing them apart. And then he pictured that same species building warships that could crack moons, driven by the exact same passion, the same overwhelming need to take what was inside them and make it real. That was the piece the Empire had missed. A warship is scary. A fleet is terrifying. Advanced technology is intimidating. But nothing was as profoundly unsettling as the realization that the same beings who built these planet killers were the ones who wrote symphonies and novels about love, loss, and the simple beauty of a sunset. The galaxy had known powerful species before. It had never encountered one that was both powerful and beautiful. Counselor Skull felt his war coalition starting to fracture. It's hard to rally troops against an enemy when their music is being played in every park and plaza in the capital. It's difficult to label them monsters when their stories make your people weep with empathy, and their jokes make them laugh until their sides ache. Every single day, the cultural exchange was dismantling the wall of fear Skull had so carefully constructed. He was getting desperate. On the 31st day after first contact, Skull made a choice that would seal his fate. He held a secret meeting with a faction of military hardliners from the Empire's outer fringes. These weren't diplomats. They were soldiers who believed survival depended on action, not words. Skull gave them the old survey data on Earth's solar system, the very same data a quiet observer had gathered 197 years ago. "The humans showed us their warships," Skull told them, "but a fleet has to have a home port. Take out their home," he urged, "and the fleet becomes nothing but a band of orphans with nowhere to go. Their homeworld is a single planet, just one. Destroy it, and this human problem disappears forever." It was genocide packaged as a military strategy. The officers eagerly agreed. They gathered a stealth fleet of 200 ships from reserve forces, ships no one would miss right away. They armed them with their most devastating weapons and fed the old survey data into their navigation computers. The fleet leaped into subspace, arriving moments later at the edge of the solar system, poised to begin their attack on the third planet from the sun. They were ready to extinguish the human threat for good. But they found a surprise waiting for them. Earth was encased in a defensive grid. 10,000 autonomous weapons platforms hung in the silent darkness of space, orbiting the planet and scattered throughout the inner system. They were positioned in overlapping fields of fire, covering every conceivable angle of attack. Each platform was about the size of an Imperial frigate, and each one bristled with weapons whose energy signatures were so powerful they suggested they could fracture a planet's crust. 10,000 of them. The stealth fleet had barely dropped out of subspace when every single one of those platforms swiveled to face them. 200 ships, detected in under a second, targeted in under 2. And then a message echoed across all their communication channels. It was automated. The voice wasn't angry or menacing. It was perfectly calm and clear, like a pre-recorded announcement at a spaceport. "You are seen. You are welcome to depart. You will not receive another warning." 200 ships floated in the void, at the edge of a strange solar system. 200 captains stared at their sensor readings and saw 10,000 planet killers pointed right at them. The math was brutally simple. It was final. They turned around. Every last ship powered up its subspace drive and jumped back the way it came. Not a single shot was fired. The thought didn't even cross their minds. You don't fight 10,000 automated death machines with 200 ships. You don't fight them with 2,000 ships. You simply don't fight them at all. The news reached Skull in his private office on the capital world. The fleet had returned, having failed to fire a single shot. Earth was a fortress. He sank into his chair, staring blankly at the wall. And finally, he understood. The humans hadn't shown the Conclave everything. They had shown them their warships, their dreadnoughts, their ability to attack. What they had conveniently left out was their ability to defend. Because the defense grid wasn't in the data crystal. The 10,000 platforms weren't in any of the schematics. The humans had let the Empire inspect their sword, but they had never, ever mentioned the impenetrable castle it was kept in. They had a shield, a secret one, and it was far bigger than their sword. On a planet called Vor Prime, in a public park near the university, a young man named Turk sat on a bench, listening to Beethoven for the 43rd time. As the sun dipped low, the city's crystal towers splintered the light into a kaleidoscope of colors, just like his friend Solwyn had taught him to see. He had no idea about the secret fleet that had just been moments from his home. He didn't know about the defense grid that had saved him. He had no clue that the entire galaxy had just teetered on the brink of a war that would have left nothing but ash. He just sat there, lost in the music, watching the sunset, and thinking about a species that could feel so much pain and beauty all at once, and somehow find a way to keep going. He figured they had to be the bravest people he'd ever known, not for their starships or their weapons, but for their music. Because in the face of a vast, cold universe that couldn't care less if they lived or died, they still found a reason to sing. Miles away, Counselor Vaith Skull stood in the heart of the conclave chamber, bound in chains. They weren't real chains, of course. The Vori never used physical restraints on their own. These were just ceremonial bands of dull gray metal, symbols that clinked softly around his wrists when he moved. They were for show. They sent a clear message to everyone in the room. This man was guilty, and these would be his last words as a free being. But Skull didn't look defeated. He stood tall, his bronze scales shimmering in the chamber's amber glow, his eyes sharp and unyielding. The charges were staggering. He'd launched an illegal military attack. He'd built a secret fleet from the shadows. He'd tried to commit genocide. The proof was overwhelming. His own officers had turned against him. Speaker Orth read the list of crimes, his ancient voice slow and heavy, each word landing in the silence like a stone dropped into a bottomless well. Unauthorized mobilization of Imperial military assets, conspiracy to commit acts of war, attempted annihilation of a sovereign world, violation of the Neutral Corridor Accords. When the list was done, it was Skull's turn to speak. It was tradition, a final courtesy to the condemned. He scanned the chamber, 1,000 faces staring back. He saw anger, sadness, and fear, but they weren't afraid of him. They were afraid because they knew his actions came from a fear they all shared. He was just the one who'd been reckless enough to act on it. "I'm not sorry," Skull said, his voice perfectly calm. "I will not apologize for defending this empire. Call me a criminal. Call me a warmonger. Throw me in a cell until my scales crumble to dust. But I want you all to remember one thing." He paused, locking eyes with Speaker Orth. 200 years ago, they were primitives, stuck on their own planet. In just 200 years, they built a fleet that could challenge ours. He let that sink in. 200 years. You sit here celebrating peace, listening to their music, reading their stories, and you're ignoring the only question that matters. What will they become in another 200 years? Or 500? Or 1,000? The chamber was dead silent. "You don't understand what they are," Skull said, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than anger entered his voice. It was raw, honest terror. "They are not a species. They are a force of nature. They don't stop. They don't slow down. They don't hit a peak and level off like every other civilization has. They just keep going, keep building, keep advancing. And one day, whether it's in 100 years or 1,000, they will be so far beyond us that we'll be like insects to them." He gave the chamber one last look. "I tried to stop that," he said quietly. "I failed. A pity. Because you will all live long enough to wish I hadn't." He said nothing more as the guards led him away. A heavy silence filled the room long after he was gone, because everyone knew he was right. Not about the genocide. That was a monstrous idea no one would defend. But his question hung in the air like a great crack in the foundation of their empire. What would humans be in another 2 centuries? Finally, Speaker Orth rose, his old, bark-like skin creaking with the effort. He spoke with the wisdom of someone who knew that fear was the absolute worst guide for making decisions. "Counselor Skull asked the correct question," Orth began. "What will the humans become? The truth is, I don't know. None of us can. But I do know this. The answer to that question will be shaped by what we do right now. If we treat them like an enemy, that's exactly what they'll become. If we try to box them in, they'll eventually break out and remember us as their jailers. If we ignore them, They'll surpass us in the shadows, just as they did before. He gazed out at the assembly. Or, we can do something this empire hasn't done in 12,000 years. We can treat them as equals, not because we have to, but because it's the right thing to do. And because the only other option is a future where the most powerful species in the galaxy remembers we tried to snuff them out. A murmur went through the crowd. Orth raised a hand for quiet. Ambassador Zhao has requested to address us one last time. I think we owe it to her to listen. Elena Zhao walked to the center of the chamber. She looked different now. Not older, but weathered. The past few weeks of non-stop negotiations and sleepless nights had clearly taken a toll. But her eyes were still sharp, her posture still proud. And when she spoke, her voice had a quiet strength that commanded attention. I have listened to Counselor Skull's words, she said, and I want to tell you something you might not expect. He's not wrong. The room fell instantly silent. Humanity will keep advancing, Zhao continued. We will create new technologies. We will expand. We will grow. It's who we are. We can't stop it, any more than you can stop a river from flowing to the sea. In 200 years, yes, we will almost certainly be more powerful than we are now. She paused. Counselor Skull is right about that. But he is wrong about what that power means. Power isn't the same as intent. A knife can be used to slice bread or to take a life. The knife doesn't get to choose. The hand holding it does. And we are here to tell you what our choice is. She reached into her uniform and pulled out a second data crystal, smaller than the first, glowing with a warm, golden light. This is a formal proposal from the Terran Unified Government. We call it the Galactic Compact. She held it up for all to see. It is not a treaty of surrender. We will never bow to anyone again, and we would never ask that of you. It is not a temporary alliance we'll discard when it's no longer useful. It is a compact, a binding promise between equals. She placed the crystal on the podium. The terms are straightforward. Humanity will share all of its technology, our fusion reactors, our shield systems, our medical breakthroughs, with every species who signs. Everything we have built over 200 years of living in fear, we will give away freely. A wave of stunned disbelief washed over the chamber. Zhao waited for it to settle. In addition, humanity will commit our military to defend any signatory who comes under attack. An attack on one is an attack on all. No one in this compact will ever have to face a threat alone again. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. This was the moment. In return, she said, looking out across the sea of alien faces, we ask for only one thing. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a thunderclap. Never again catalog a species as being beneath you. She let the silence stretch. No more Tier 9 classifications. No more landing on a world, writing primitive in a file, and then flying away forever. No more looking down on a people who haven't reached the stars and deciding they just don't matter. Because we were that species. We were the ones in that file. We remember how it felt. Her voice was steady, calm, and utterly certain. Every species matters. Every world matters. Every civilization struggling to build its first fire or launch its first rocket matters, because you have no idea what they might become. You didn't know what we would become. And if we hadn't gotten lucky, if we hadn't found that probe, we might still be stuck on Earth, staring up at the night sky and wondering why no one ever came. She stepped back. That is our offer, our technology, our protection, our partnership, in exchange for a promise that this galaxy will never again treat a young race like something to be filed away and forgotten. That's what humanity wants, Ambassador Zhao said softly. It's all we've ever wanted. The old alien leader, Speaker Orth, was silent for a long, long time. The warm, amber light of the chamber highlighted the ancient patterns on his bark-like skin, When he finally looked up, his eyes were glistening with an emotion she didn't have a name for. "Ambassador," he began, his voice raspy with age, "your people were terrified of us. You built weapons that could wipe out everything we've built in 12,000 years. And now, you're offering to just give it all away?" He leaned forward. "Forgive an old man, but I have to ask, why? Why would you surrender the one thing that makes you invincible?" Zhao offered a small, tired, but genuine smile. "Because we know what it's like to look up at the sky," she said, terrified and alone, wondering if anyone out there even cared if we lived or died. "We spent 200 years building a wall around our world because we thought we had no other choice. But a wall doesn't just keep you safe, it keeps you alone. And we're tired of being alone, Speaker. We're tired of being afraid." She glanced up at the incredible crystal ceiling. "We built all this power so we could stand here today and say, 'The wall is open. Come on in. We'll protect you. And all we ask in return is that you promise to do the same for the next person who needs help.' That's the deal. That's the compact." The vote wasn't unanimous, not by a long shot. 17 species, mostly allies of a rival faction, or just too proud to accept help from a race they'd recently labeled as primitive, voted no. But it didn't matter. The vote was an overwhelming 83 in favor. The Galactic Compact was signed right there, in the warm amber light of that chamber. And when it was over, Speaker Orth and Ambassador Zhao clasped hands. The room didn't just clap politely. It erupted. It was real applause, the kind that comes from pure relief and hope, the kind of sound that makes you feel like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. The news shot across the galaxy like a beam of light. In the months that followed, everything changed. Human engineers showed up on 100 different planets, sharing fusion power with species still using ancient reactors. Medical teams brought cures for diseases that had tormented civilizations for centuries. Scientists helped turn barren moons into lush gardens, and teachers created programs where kids from different worlds could learn side by side. And the humans? They just kept getting better. They developed new improvements to their own technology and shared them instantly. Within 3 years, they solved a physics problem that had stumped the galaxy's best minds for 800 years. And they didn't sell the solution. They published it for free. For everyone. But then something happened that nobody saw coming. The other species started advancing too. Being around human creativity, their stubborn refusal to accept that some problems were impossible was infectious. Alien scientists who hadn't had a new idea in centuries started experimenting again. Engineers started pushing the limits. Philosophers started asking dangerous new questions. The entire galaxy was waking up. Not because humanity ordered it to, but because humanity had reminded it of a simple truth it had long forgotten. The universe is full of mysteries, and the greatest adventure is trying to solve them. 50 years flew by. On a massive university space station, floating peacefully between 3 star systems, Professor Thrak of the Chalith stood before his class. He was one of the first professors hired under the Galactic Compact, and this was now the greatest center of learning in the galaxy. Students from every species in the Compact sat together, learned together, and argued together. Professor Thrak was old now. His shell, once a smooth, dark brown, was now a cracked, lighter pattern that showed his age. He walked with a cane made from the heartwood of a tree from a distant world, a gift from a dear friend. But his mind was as sharp as ever. The lecture hall was packed. 40 students from 8 different species, including 2 from a brand new species that had joined the Compact just 15 years ago, and 7 humans, all watched him intently. They knew he told stories, not just recited facts. Thrak looked out at all the young faces and felt a wave of what he'd spent 50 years learning the human word for. Gratitude. "Today," he began, his voice clicking softly, "I'm going to tell you a story. It's about the day everything changed. You've read about it, heard bits and pieces, but I was there. So you're going to hear it right. He tapped his cane once on the floor for effect. 50 years ago, I was a young, bored student, and I thought the universe had no more surprises. Then one day, a sensor officer at a remote outpost detected something that shouldn't have been there. It didn't match any ship in our databases. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. The officer's name was Tilen Vask. He was a good officer, very by the book. So when he saw something impossible, he did what any good officer would do. He checked his sensors again. Thrak smiled, his mandibles parting just slightly. After 50 years together, the humans in the room knew exactly what that meant. He checked the readings twice, Thrak continued, and they didn't change, because the ship sitting out there was very real. It was called the Prometheus, and it belonged to a species that our empire had dismissed as pre-spaceflight primitives less than 200 years earlier. He let that sink in. The humans had done the impossible. In the time it took most species to invent a slightly better toaster, they had gone from burning fossil fuels to building the most powerful warship the galaxy had ever seen. They'd done it in total secret, and they'd done it because they were terrified. He looked directly at the human students. They met his gaze, their expressions calm. They had grown up in a galaxy that respected them, that saw them as partners. They had never known that darkness. They had never had to look at the stars and wonder if something was coming to wipe them out. That was the gift their grandparents had given them. But here, the old professor said, his voice dropping to a whisper, is the part of the story I need you to remember. The humans could have used that power to conquer us all. They could have burned our worlds and taken everything, and nobody could have stopped them. He reached down and picked up a small, worn-out device from his desk. It was an ancient piece of tech, scratched and faded, with a single button and a tiny speaker. Everyone just held their breath, waiting to see what they would do. He held up a small, worn-out music player, the very same one Dr. Rena Solwyn had given him 50 years ago. For generations, the galaxy whispered that humans were monsters, Thrak said, his voice echoing slightly. But when they finally arrived, they didn't offer a threat. They offered us a song. He pressed a button. A faint crackle came from the tiny speaker, and then the opening notes of Beethoven's Symphony No. 9 began to fill the lecture hall. The sound was thin, a mere ghost from an ancient device, but it didn't matter. The music was the music. It hadn't changed in centuries, and it wouldn't change for centuries more. The humans were never the monsters we feared, Thrak explained over the melody. They were frightened children who built a mighty fortress, and then against all logic, they opened the door. They were a species that felt everything so intensely, they had to invent art just to survive their own hearts. They were the ones who stared into the endless, terrifying dark and decided to sing. He paused, letting the symphony wash over the room. The hall was completely silent. A few students were openly weeping. The Korath exchange students, new to human music, sat frozen, their huge, dark eyes wide with an emotion they didn't have a name for yet, an emotion they would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. That is the story, Thrak continued softly. That's the story of how one little ship changed the entire galaxy. Not with its weapons, not with its shields, and not with its impossible engine. It changed everything because the people on board chose to be bigger than their fear. He switched off the music player and set it down with reverence. Class dismissed. As the students quietly packed their belongings and filed out, Thrak stood alone at the front of the vast, empty room. He listened to the silence, remembering a day 50 years past, sitting on a bench in a garden on Valor Prime, listening to Beethoven for the very first time and not understanding why he was crying. He understood now. Just as the last students were leaving, a human girl with dark hair and startlingly bright eyes hesitated by the door. She had been sitting next to a Viore classmate, a young male with handsome green scales who had been furiously scribbling notes the whole time. The human girl leaned in close to him and whispered with a conspiratorial grin. "We also built a really, really big gun," she said. Just in case. The Viore student stared at her for a second, his expression unreadable. Then he exploded with laughter. It was a real, deep-from-the-gut laugh that shook his shoulders and was so infectious it made the girl start laughing too. Grinning at each other, they walked out together into the sprawling corridor of the university station. Here, students from 8 different species hurried to their next classes, the cafeteria, or the observation deck, where you could watch 3 suns set at once. The hallway buzzed with the sound of a dozen languages, and in the distance, someone was playing human music on a speaker. A little further down, a Chelith student was butchering the timing on a joke he'd heard from a human friend, but everyone was laughing anyway. The galaxy wasn't perfect. It would never be. There were still arguments, old tensions, and lingering distrust between species. Wounds that hadn't quite healed. But it was better. It was so much better than it had been. And it all began with a single ship. A single, bizarre reading on a sensor display. A diligent sensor officer who ran the numbers twice. And a species that, despite being terrified of the dark, decided against all reason and probability to light a fire so brilliant the entire galaxy could see it. The Prometheus was a museum now. It floated in a silent, geosynchronous orbit above the university station, preserved exactly as it was on the day it first breached the neutral corridor. Students now take field trips to see it. They walk its hallowed corridors, place their hands on its cold hull, and try to imagine what it must have felt like on that historic day, when the whole galaxy was a terrifying unknown, and the only thing separating humanity from total oblivion was the deck beneath their feet. On the observation deck of the Prometheus, there's a plaque. Captain Lena Vasquez had it installed the day the ship was decommissioned. It's simple, just a few words etched into steel, because humans always had a thing for steel, even after they mastered building with crystals and light. The plaque reads, "We were afraid. We built this ship. Then we opened the door." It's signed, "The crew of the UNS Prometheus, on behalf of humanity." But right below the official plaque, someone taped a small, handwritten note. No one knows who put it there or when. It's been there for years, and no one has ever had the heart to remove it. The note says, "P.S. The guns still work." Far, far below the station, the stars burned on, just as they always had, and always will. But they didn't look the same anymore. They no longer seemed cold, distant, and uncaring. They looked like a neighborhood. And humanity, after so many long years of fear and silence and building walls in the dark, was finally home.